In 1899, the streets of New York echoed with the voices of Newsies. Carrying the banner for a penny a pape, the Newsies were a ragged army without a leader, until one day, all that changed. And if you just recognized that as the opening lines to the 1992 cult film classic Newsies, then you're my kind of people. Welcome to Remember, a podcast about history, mysteries. And did you know that the actor who played Spot Conlon in the movie Newsies, the cutest boy in the whole cast, and yes, Christian Bale is in the movie, also played the voice of Littlefoot in The Land Before Time? I learned that researching this episode. Also, these are two very specific cultural references.
I have seen The Land Before Time. Don't watch it. It's too sad.
It's so sad.
I haven't seen Newsies. Newsboys? What's it called?
Newsies.
Newsies. I haven't seen it, nor do I care to.
It's one of my favorite movies, so we should probably watch it at some point.
In my mind, the film is in black and white.
It's not.
And I like a black and white film. Actually, now I mention it, I don't know why I said that. Like, most of my favourite films are black and white. And Sideways with Paul Giamatti, who can do anything.
It's okay. I promise this episode is not going to be one big reference to the movie Newsies. It's truly a look at the real historical story that inspired that movie. But just like in our episode about women in baseball and The League of Their Own, this really isn't about the movie itself. But it is about us, your hosts, Matthew and Paula. It's not really about us. I just didn't have a good segue, honestly.
No, I don't think it is about us. If anything, we're just bringing you some stuff that we learned. That's the point of the show.
It's the mid-1800s, and U.S. cities are starting to see the rise of the penny press. This is a tabloid-esque style of newspaper, usually about 4 pages long, costing...
Threepence?
A penny. Threepence. We didn't have shit like that in the U.S.
You missed out on a great time.
Until it all changed in, what, the 70s? The 80s?
I like how you are, as an American, so against the metric system, yet when our money was imperial, you still mock it.
I don't understand how any of this works. So more buttoned up or traditional newspapers for this time cost more like 6 cents a paper. And that wasn't nearly as accessible to the middle and lower classes as just 1 penny. Plus, the stories in those papers were boring. Like, penny press papers included sports and gossip and advice.
And boobs?
And, well, who knows? Maybe, possible.
That's a very British newspaper thing to have in.
Just have boobs in them?
We still got boobs in a lot of our newspapers. Page 3.
That is weird. Yeah, I don't think they had stuff like that.
Missing out.
A lot more people wanted to and could afford to read these penny press papers, boobs or not. But how would all these papers, printed multiple times a day, get to this big new audience of readers?
Some type of wind turbine?
That was one option that they did try. And unfortunately, it blew all the papers apart.
Could they have used the American tradition of the T-shirt cannon? I think the T-shirt cannon, as I've said before, is America's greatest cultural touchstone.
Well, I think we learned recently in a certain episode you hosted about gladiators that the T-shirt cannon actually comes from ancient Rome.
True. America just has the jet ski. That's it.
Well, and soon we're going to find out that the Greeks invented that. What America had wasn't a T-shirt cannon, wasn't a wind turbine. It was a child, the newsie, or newsboy, which is what they were called even when referring to newsies who weren't boys. Because there were female newsies, though they were the minority, and some were grown men as old as 21, though they were mostly children or teens, some as young as 6 years old.
I had a paper route when I was a child. When I was 10.
And did you work it until midnight every night before going to school the next day?
No, I did it after school, and it took about an hour.
It's a little bit different. A little bit different as we're going to find out.
Well, 10's pretty young to have a job, Paula. We had to get the newspaper route in my sister's name because she was 13.
You cheaters.
Yeah, then me and my brother did it together between us because we're twins.
Just had to share everything as twins.
Well, it was too much for one 10-year-old to do, Paula, frankly, I
But
think.
one 13-year-old could have done it.
Yeah, well, there's a big difference between a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old.
That's true. It is interesting that newspaper delivery seems to, for whatever reason, have always been the, domain of the child. Why? It's interesting.
It's interesting that is traditionally the case, right?
Even modern day, it's what are jobs that youth can do? Deliver papers, mow lawns, provide childcare.
Well, how wrong can any of those things go?
At least they're not, in a factory.
Exactly.
No one's getting their finger caught in a factory machine unless they're very careless with the lawnmower.
Yeah, I mean, I had, as a child growing up in Britain, I had my arm in one or two threshing machines like anyone else. But you only make that mistake once.
Because you have no more arms to make the mistake with again.
Well, essentially, you can make the mistake twice, to be clear.
You can make it twice, and then you're armless. This was a time in the U.S. when child labor was all the rage, and the children of poor families in cities got up early and worked before school and then after school as well, or skipped school altogether and just worked all day. Many kids were expected to contribute to the family finances, and a lot of times adults just wanted them out of the house, especially in places like New York City. The lower class was living in tiny apartments shared by multiple generations or even multiple families. So it's like a 2-room apartment that could have 3 different families living in it. There wasn't room to hang around inside all day playing video games. Also, there were no video games. It's the 1800s.
Nothing but your imagination and a bottle of absinthe.
That's right. So those kids took that absinthe and their imagination out of the house into the streets. And they were playing in the streets or working in the streets. And to the adults in their lives, that was ideal. But a lot of newsboys didn't even have that. They were homeless, sleeping outside newspaper offices until the morning editions were ready. Or maybe in one of the lodging set up specifically for newsies, boarding houses where beds were cheap or sometimes free and they only had to pay for meals.
I imagine that on a winter's night, the only warmth you'd get was when you first got your bundle of newspapers hot off the presses and you could kind of hold on to them for 10 seconds before starting shoving them. Well, you don't shove them through doors, you hand them out, don't you?
Yeah, this is a little different because these were not people who were subscribed and committed to buying these papers and you were just delivering them. You were literally hawking these papers, trying to convince people to buy them off of you.
I tell you what would really get those newspapers selling. Boobs on page 3. Boobs. We got boobs on page 3.
You know exactly how to be a newsie. We're going to talk about it later, but they said whatever they needed to say to sell a paper. Because they weren't employed by any of the newspapers themselves. They were all freelancers. Newsies would buy the papers wholesale from the publisher and then directly sell them to the readers. Under this system, these papers didn't really have a way of getting into the hands of the masses except for the newsies. The newspapers themselves set the prices that the newsies paid for their wares and that the public paid for the papers. So the newsies would pay 50 cents for a bundle of 100 papers. And then they sold those papers to readers for a penny each. Like we said earlier, it's a penny press. They had to sell 50 of their 100 papers to even break even for the day. And anything they didn't sell was, of course, worthless once a new edition came out the next morning. It was literally yesterday's news. And the publishers wouldn't buy back those unsold papers. The newsies had to eat the cost of anything they didn't sell.
It's a completely risk-free model then for the newspapers.
Yeah.
They guarantee their sales, and that's that. And it's all these children taking the risk on. That's bad because the kids have got to buy them. They're going to buy them every day, but they can't guarantee the quality of what's in the newspapers.
Exactly. Which meant they would do just about whatever it took to move that merchandise, like we were just saying. So this most often meant tugging on the heartstrings of would-be customers because they can't rely necessarily on just the headlines that the newspapers were putting out. They might pretend to be sick or play up their poverty with dirty faces and raggedy clothing just to get people walking by to like feel bad for them and buy a paper from them. There was the last pape ruse, where they'd get someone to buy their last paper so they could stop working for the day. But somehow they always seem to have one more last paper for the next customer who walked by.
That's a good one.
They actually do this in, I promise I did not write any references to Newsies in the script, but there is a moment in the movie where they do this, and like one of the like little kid is like, he's like, buy me last paper, mister. And then he buys it, and then he's like, his brother's like, you don't have a cold, and we have like 20 more papers to sell. And he's like, pfft. He bought it.
President McKinley, dead, maybe, but it could be. Who knows?
Yeah, they would embellish headlines to appeal to the curiosity of passersby who might be potential customers.
Theodore Roosevelt punched a pigeon to death in the streets. Read all about that.
They would sometimes make up stories completely. And it wasn't anything that the papers themselves weren't doing. This was the time of yellow journalism. Articles that fabricated details or whole stories to make the news more exciting or dramatic.
I've got this amazing story I want to cover on the podcast, which is kind of a great example of that. Mm-hmm. It is a bit of a UFO story, but it's one that's spread all across the country in America, and it's about these blimps that were seen. It's exactly this era, and it's super interesting, so that will be coming up at some point.
That sounds really interesting. The rise of this practice, this yellow journalism, is actually often attributed to the rivalry between William Randolph Hearst's paper, The Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer's paper, The World. These two had fierce competition and were obsessed with doing whatever it took to outsell each other. And, I mean, the Newsies didn't mind. The more exciting the headlines, the easier it was to sell the papers. And in 1898, it was very easy to sell papers. And that's because of the Spanish-American War, which just might make its own very good episode of the show sometime in the future. I'm looking into talking about it. I might actually do an episode that focuses just on how the newspapers affected the war, because some people think we wouldn't have even gone into the war if it hadn't been for the way newspapers were reporting the story about the Spanish in Cuba. But like I said, that's beyond the scope of this particular episode.
There is also a show coming up about the Siege of Bel Air, which is the last stand of the Spanish in the Philippines, which is the Spanish-American War at that time.
Yeah, it's part of that. It's interesting because I was thinking about that, actually, Matthew, while I was researching this, because I was doing some research on the Spanish-American War while researching this episode, because they're related. And I was like, oh, and this has to do with the Philippines. And I know some of these stories because you talked about them in your travel vlog when you went to the Philippines on Yesland, which is Matthew's YouTube channel, where he travels around. It was just a funny point of reference.
Yeah.
For now, the Spanish-American War matters here just because the newspapers sensationalized the crap out of this war, and the American people were clamoring for this news.
Now, the audience can't see that you did a little quote-unquote news there, but I feel like we could sense it in your voice.
I hope they could hear it in my voice, that there is some quotes around the word news. It is interesting. This is such a side tangent that has nothing to do with anything really, but people often lament the decline of journalistic ethics now, but when you really look back at the history of newspapers and journalism, I don't know, humans be humanin', right? We've always kind of been like this. Anyway, so many papers were selling during the Spanish-American War that wholesale prices went up from 50 cents for a bundle of 100 papers to 60 cents for a bundle of 100 papers. And the Newsies didn't care because their sales had increased so much. So they were still selling for a penny a paper, but they were selling so many more papers. But then the war ended and sales slowed down. And all the publishers set their wholesale prices back to 50 cents per bundle. Except for two. Any guesses who those two might be?
Hearsts and Pulitzers.
Yeah. So instead of making 50 cents, if the Newsies sold their whole bundle of 100 papers, they were only making 40 cents if they sold their whole bundle. And they were not selling all 100 papers. At this time, Newsies were averaging about 27 cents of profit each day.
But wouldn't that just be the death knell for those newspapers? Because the Newsies would choose to work with other newspapers who they could make a bigger profit margin from. But then again, I suppose the actual newspapers themselves are that much more popular for being the biggest.
Yes. Well, and it is like people would come by and ask for... Because a newsie might have the Sun, the World, the Journal, the Times, and someone might come by and be like, oh, I want the World. I'm like, okay, here. I want the Journal. And those are the ones that would cost the newsies more. But that's the paper they were going to sell because that's the one the public was asking for.
I bet the rivalry between newsies themselves was massive.
Oh, yeah. They had territory. It was apparently like they had territory. They had a rivalry in terms of like, hey, you shouldn't be selling papers on my corner, this and that. But there's also a lot of stories about how they really looked out for each other. Like the older newsies would look out for the younger ones, protect them, teach them how to sell papers. There might be a thing where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to buy 2 bundles and then you're going to help me sell it and we're going to split the profits in a percentage or, whatever. So there are a lot of stories about how they looked out for each other, but that should not take away from the fact that there were rivalries, there was a lot of territory and things like that. Because, yeah, if you come in and sell your papers to the people who normally buy from me, I can't have lunch today.
I imagine as well a lot of the rival would be if like a group of newsies coming from Staten Island into Manhattan and that type of thing, rather than on the different streets of Manhattan itself. Or like, I'm from the lower east side, you sell on the west side or in the village or something, and it's not, you can't come into this area. But like in a very small area, they probably all knew each other and were looking out for each other.
Yeah, I think so. So this is all happening, and then the newsies discover some of their bundles of papers from the Journal and the World are being shorted and didn't even have 100 papers in them. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So, sometime around approximately July 18th, 1899, a group of newsies go on strike against the Evening Journal and the Evening World. And they are joined by newsboys across all the boroughs of New York City and even into New Jersey. Until the wholesale price is put back to 50 cents, they won't be selling any of Pulitzer or Hearst's papers.
I mean, they have the power because there's no other way of distribution. They've been abusing this distribution model since time immemorial, and they hadn't bargained for the idea that the newsies could get together and strike, and that they actually do have a huge amount of bargaining, a massive position. They are a huge part of this whole industry.
Well, yeah, and part of the problem is that these newspaper publishers, these tycoons, these robber barons, don't recognize that. They really are taking for granted the labor of the newsies.
Which is their mistake, right? That's the thing.
Yeah. Well, and at first, Pulitzer and Hearst are like, whatever, who cares? It's a bunch of kids. What do they know about unions and striking?
The basics.
Yeah,
That's all you really need.
They read your paper for a living. They have been shouting your headlines about the current trolley worker strike. They travel all over the city trying to sell your papers. They're connected to other people who are selling newspapers. They understand New York. They understand how to connect with different people all over the city. They understand...
And the working class.
The working class. Yeah, and they understand how to get public opinion on their side, and they learned it from you, Dad.
Well, that's something you'll bring into the podcast on your own, and that's something for you to work out on your own time.
Do you know that that might be a very American thing where, like, there's, like, one of those drug PSAs or whatever, where, like, the dad's like, I found this weed under your bed. Like, where did you learn about this? And he's like, I learned it from you, Dad.
We didn't have drug PSAs.
Yeah, y'all had PSAs about, like, don't get in the water because you're going to get electrocuted.
Watch out for the riptide. Watch out for the riptide.
I've seen some of y'all's creepy like 70s and 80s PSAs about safety.
Maybe I haven't. Don't put your hand in the blender. I don't know.
I think they were a bit before your time. I only know about them because we watched a couple of them during the strike for Gallifrey Gals.
Yeah.
Some of our older British viewers were like, you should watch these weird PSAs that we had in Britain that were like, stay away from the quarry.
I used to play in a quarry when I was a kid. That's where we used to go. There's a quarry near me, and we used to go dirt jumping. And what it meant is, because obviously it was such a massive amount of loose sand, you could jump off a cliff into the sand like you were jumping into water. So we used to go there and do backflips off it. And it was, or ride our bike off it and stuff, because we were all been watching Jackass.
Oh my gosh. You're lucky you didn't permanently injure yourself.
Man, I bet I could still go there.
You should see.
I should go and have some fun and relive my youth.
That's right. And break some bones because you're much older now.
I'm not that much older.
Pull some muscles.
I would pull a muscle.
Yeah.
Oh, I landed a bit sharp there, my hip.
Back to the topic at hand. The leaders of the Newsboys strike actually go to the Journal and the World and they say, hey, we see what you've been printing about the trolley worker strike and the way you support their cause. You're calling for the public to support them. You're calling for their rights as laborers to be respected. Why are we different from that? Well, I think we know why, right? Because
it's because they don't want to foot the bill.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the bill is fair pay. The bill isn't anything more than fairness.
Yeah.
They don't want to be ripped off.
Mm-hmm.
The bill isn't, we want a massive raise and we want better hours and all this type of stuff. No, the bill, what they wanted was a bundle of newspapers for 50 cents and there to be 100 of them.
Just like all the other papers we're doing. Yeah.
Stop ripping us off.
Yeah.
That's what we're asking. We're not asking for special treatment. We want you to not rip us off. That's the thing. And you could say, well, you're not going to write it about, I know you're not going to write about this in your newspaper. And it wouldn't matter even if you did, because no one's going to read your newspaper.
Because we're not selling it. Yeah.
Because we're not delivering it.
Yeah. And the Journal and the World didn't print any articles at all about the strike, but the other papers in town do. Because this strike is only specifically against the Journal and the World.
And this is such bad press. This is the worst kind of press. And it's direct attacks against your opponents. That's so juicy.
What's really cool, too, is a lot of the research for this episode comes straight from newspaper articles printed about the strike while it was happening, which is really cool. The articles are pretty colorful, and I think sometimes a bit dramatized, actually. A lot of the reporters writing, they just added a lot of description, a lot of flowery description that you're like, you don't know exactly how factual it all is, but I think we can get a pretty accurate idea of how the strike went down.
Newsies and Journal employees tussle in the streets this morning, that kind of stuff,
Oh, yeah.
Punches were thrown at the World this morning.
They also had this habit of writing out the speech of the Newsboys, kind of the way it sounded. So it's a lot of like, hey, mister, we knows that the papes ain't on our side. That's how they're written. Their quotes of the Newsboys are written like that. So according to one of these articles, the strike leaders went to the Journal a few days into the strike to make their demands. And Hearst responded by asking what the World was going to do. What's the World going to do? And one of the leaders responded with, we're talking to the Journal. We want to know what you're going to do. And Hearst is like, we'll think about it and let you know. Because the World's not going to give in if the Journal doesn't give in. And the Journal doesn't want to give in if the World's not going to give in. Because they're competing.
But they're both losing so much money. That's the problem. They can't go on forever.
While waiting for the World and the Journal to give in and realize that they can't go on forever, the Newsboys had to get all the leverage they could. They needed to stop the sale of issues of the two papers, and they needed to get the public on their side. So, they made signs. They held demonstrations. They printed ads in the other newspapers. One such ad was printed in The Sun on July 23rd and read, quote, "Help us in our struggle to get a fair play by not buying the Journal or the World. Help us. Do not ask for the World or Journal, the Newsboys Union." So they're putting ads in other papers saying, hey, please public, boycott this paper with us.
And those newspapers would have been so happy to print those.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
They're like, yeah, don't ask for the Journal of the World, buy the Sun. They also printed these ads as their own flyers that they would hand out to people on the street. They tried to organize a big parade with a band to help drum up support, but they had to cancel it because they ran into trouble trying to get the permit they needed to have like a public gathering. First, they were like, oh, we didn't realize we needed a permit to do this. And then they're like, okay, well, we'll go down to the permit office. And then they couldn't get a permit. Like the guy was like, no, I'm not going to give it to you.
But also, Hearst and Pulitzer have massive sway. They're huge barons. They're huge socialites and in town. So they could probably say, well, no, don't give them a goddamn parade, whatever you do. That's not good. We don't want that. You don't know what's going on in the background, those kind of machinations.
Yes, that's totally true. So this was all to get public opinion on their side, right? But they also need to stop the sale of papers. And the Newsies knew to do this, they needed total unity. But not everybody was on their side. So, some people had to have their minds changed.
Yeah, it's classic union behavior, though. Right?
And these were
Frankly.
mostly rough and tumble street kids who were not afraid of a little violence. They would swarm and tip over wagons distributing papers, tearing up all the merchandise. If they caught you being a scab and selling you the papers, they'd knock them from your hands, destroy them, and they'd beat you up. They were even known to knock papers out of the hands of readers who'd purchased a copy of the Journal or the World. It's a way to get people to go like, well, I'm not going to buy that because one of these street kids is just going to steal it from me and tear it up.
Let's buy the Sun from now on.
The only scabs who were safe from these kinds of repercussions were the girls. So female newsies could hide issues of the Journal or the World under their skirts, pretending to support the strike, but selling the papers anyway. One of the strike leaders, Kid Blink, they all have great names, is quoted in the New York Sun as saying, quote, "A feller can't soak a lady, and you can't get at them women scabs papes without soaking 'em. We'll have to let 'em alone, I guess." Not all female newsies were against the strike, but they were harder to convince because the newsies, the boys, felt like they didn't have any repercussions against them. Kid Blink, a.k.a. Blink Diamond, a.k.a. Louis Belletti, was quoted a lot in the papers during the strike. He had red hair and an eye patch, which is how he got his nicknames. Other leaders were David Simmons, who was 21 and the official union leader. He'd been a newsie since he was 8 years old. Racetrack Higgins wore pink suspenders and was the leader of the Brooklyn contingent of newsies. He's the one, his character in the movie, who I referenced at the beginning, is Spot Collins. So they used a lot of the same names in the movie, but they swapped around kind of who was who, actually. Annie Kelly is noted for being a prominent female newsie who was part of the strike. No papers hidden under her skirts. These leaders were so effective in organizing their fellow newsies that 6 days into the strike, Pulitzer's managing editor at The World wrote him a memo saying that their circulation was down by 2/5. The newsies started calling for advertisers to pull out of their deals with the Journal and the World because nobody was reading those papers to see the ads.
Yeah, you're wasting your money if you're going to advertise.
Yeah, they were smart. They knew that taking that ad revenue away from the papers would be powerful. The papers know they have to do something, so they try and pay scabs $2 a day to go out and sell their papers. But of course, the newsies attack these scabs, beat them up, steal their papers, or otherwise convince them not to sell. Police are around some of the time, and some of the newsies do get arrested for this violence. But mostly the cops are tied up with the trolley strike happening at this same time. And a lot of people talk about how the timing of this really helped contribute to the success of the Newsboys strike because the authorities were tied up with this grown-up strike going on with the trolley workers.
Yeah.
Halfway through the strike, the Newsboys hold a rally to help unify the newsies from all the different parts of the city and to boost morale. So on July 25th, the New York Sun published an article about the rally with this headline: "Great Meet of Newsboys. 5,000 strikers swarm in and around New Irving Hall." So only 2,000 could actually fit inside of Irving Hall, with 3,000 crowded around outside trying to hear everything going on. There were performances and singing. The leaders all gave speeches to the crowd. Reading the speeches as reported by the article in The Sun, it struck me how smart these leaders were. They talked about sticking together to stay strong and how the efforts the papers were making to pay $2 whole to scabs was a sign that they were desperate and weakening. And I think those are really astute observations.
And it shows that they can afford it. It shows that they can afford $2 a bundle or $2 a day, which is still a much better deal if they're only making averaging 27 cents.
27 cents, yeah, which is like, I looked it up. I can't remember if I have it in here somewhere, but it's like they're making like $10 a day or something. A lot of the leaders talked as well about how they should probably stop using violence. I think that's something that some grown-ups told them they should probably all say.
Yeah, make sure you say that you're going to do that, yeah.
Honestly, because they all are like, hey, we should probably stop soaking these scabs. Just leave them alone, you know? And everyone's like, yeah, okay. So I'm going to read you a bit of this article from The Sun because it's cracking me up. David Simmons is quoted. He's saying, "We're going to win this fight, boys, only we must stick together and hold firm. The Journal and World has got the money, but we got the situation in our hands and they know it. Now I'm going to ask you to use no more violence. Let up on the scabs." "Oh, certainly," came a voice from the rear of the hall. And it is spelled Soytenly.
Just like you said it.
Yeah. "Now I mean it," continued Simmons. "We can't gain nothing by banging these fellers around. Let's fight on the level and see if we can't win out that way." So the crowd is always like, yeah, no more violence. And they're like, no, really. No more violence.
The guy with the eye patch, I can't tell if he's winking at us or if he's not winking at us.
That Kid Blink, yeah, at one point in he's like, "Now, I know that I was part of the crowd that tipped over that wagon yesterday, but that was wrong, and we shouldn't do that anymore."
Well, the problem is, if this violence escalates in any way, someone's going to die. And that's not going to help the cause, right? And that's not unlikely, right? That violence can really get out of hand in these situations.
Yeah. I do think mostly they're doing like schoolyard fights kind of violence, but that does not mean it can't, just like you said, it can't escalate.
Well, we talked about a union leader recently on the show, and there's a lot of death in that story.
Yes, there is. In Kid Blink's speech, he said, quote, "Ain't that 10 cents worth as much to us as it is to Hearst and Pulitzer, who are millionaires? Well, I guess it is. If they can't spare it, how can we? I'm trying to figure out how 10 cents on 100 papers can mean more to a millionaire than it does to a newsboy, and I can't see it. We can do more with 10 cents than he can with 25. Anyway, we wants it, and we'll strike and restrike until we get it. Won't we, boys?" I just thought, I don't know, something about that rang really, it was poignant.
Good for them. That's how you feel. It's like, good for them. They are being exploited, and it's not fair. They deserve to. You know, if I was born at that time in that city, that is what I would have been doing.
Yeah.
And goddamn, they deserve to be treated with respect. They are working hard, and they deserve to be paid for what they're doing.
This morale boost doesn't last forever, though. The papers are still offering to pay $2 a day to get their edition sold. A distributor for the Journal offers to give the Newsboys 3 papers for 1 cent. Then ups the offer to 5 papers for 1 cent. Then offers to just give away the papers to the Newsies for free. These are tempting offers that are hard to resist, and Kid Blink and David Simmons, 2 of our main strike leaders, are accused of betraying their union and taking these offers. They're seen wearing new, nice clothes, and Kid Blink is supposedly going around with 500 of the boycotted papers to sell. They're put on trial by other newsies, and they are acquitted, but they step down from their official strike leadership positions. But Pulitzer and Hearst are weakening too. Their circulation has dramatically decreased, and advertisers are pulling out.
It's their reputation that they've got to watch out for. Their circulation can bounce back. Your reputation is gone once it's gone.
So they're finally ready to arbitrate. 2 weeks into the strike, a deal is made.
This sounds like it went on for ages. 2 weeks.
I know. It's really funny because some of the things are like, strike drags on, strike's still happening. I'm like, it was only 2 weeks, but We just got out of a strike here that was like half the year, so my perception might be a little skewed, but yeah, 2 weeks. They make a deal. The Journal and the World will not decrease their wholesale price from 60 cents to 50 cents. But they will buy back any unsold papers the Newsies have at the end of the day.
Deal. That's a great deal.
Yeah. With the resolve weakening, their pockets empty, their leadership rocked, the Newsies agree.
I would take that deal. That sounds...
It's less of a risk on the Newsies' point.
They're not going to make any more money, but they aren't going to lose the money that they can't make, right?
Yeah.
And I think, fair enough, that sounds like that's a decent deal.
It's something, at least. And the strike ends August 2nd, 1899. Now, it's not too long before child labor laws start getting passed, and newspapers become more the realm of a neighborhood kid on a bike, as we were talking about with Matthew earlier, than a child shouting headlines on the street corner. And people kind of forget that the Newsboys strike of 1899 even happened. Until Disney comes out with a movie in 1992 starring Christian Bale and telling the story in the noblest form of performance art, a musical.
It's a musical as well.
It's a
Paula.
musical. It's so good. And I didn't sing a single song from it in this episode, so you're welcome. A small Paula sees this movie, and 30 years later, she is inspired to write a podcast about it. And that, dear listener, is what you just heard.
Thank you so much, Paula, for doing the research on this one.
It was fascinating. I read a lot of old newspaper articles, and they were very interesting.
I know this is. We spoke about Newsies.
I
ever since
love
I've known
Newsies.
You, right? You love it. So it's been really great to actually hear the full story because I didn't know how it ended, right? So that was a completely interesting story for me as well. I didn't know anything about it.
A little different. The ending is super different in the movie, and the way the strike starts is pretty different.
Let me guess. There's a love interest, and Christian Bale makes it with the gal who's also a newsie in the end.
She's not a newsie, but she is the sister of a newsie.
Gross. So I'm not going to be watching that.
It's a very small part of the story. It's hardly in the story at all. It's mostly a bunch of dudes dancing in the streets trying to sell papers. But it's a great movie. It's great. But it's actually pretty... I think it does a good job of translating the real events into a movie. It actually really does.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Remember. Hey, you're on YouTube. There's a few things that now we would like you to do in return for the entertainment with which you've just received.
It's just a fair thing. Look, we're not asking for an extra 10 cents or anything.
We're not asking for anything other than for you to hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when there's new episodes, which are every week. Ring the bell and all those type of things. Who cares about that? But subscribe.
Also, if you know the movie Newsies, leave me a comment with some of the lyrics quoted, and then I'll know you're my kind of person.
Or leave a comment saying, yeah, Matthew's right. Newsies sucks.
Oh!
And another great thing that you can do is tell someone about the show who you think might enjoy it. Share this video with someone who you think will get a kick out of it or any of our other episodes. And have a great week. And until next time, thanks for watching. Bye.
Keep carrying the banner.
Reds!
Different musical.
Okay, sorry.